President Yoon Suk-yeol co-chaired a virtual summit of world leaders Wednesday evening Korea time to promote protection of democratic systems against the threat of disinformation driven by artificial intelligence under the third Summit for Democracy, which Seoul played host to from this past Monday. Welcome to Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sun-hee. The third Summit for Democracy came to a close late Wednesday evening local time with the Leaders Plenary Session co-chaired by the presidents of South Korea, Kenya and Denmark. For more on this, I have Professor Kim Jae-chun at Sogang University live on the line. Professor Kim, welcome.
It's good to be here.
I also have Jessica Stone at the VOA joining us virtually. Jessica, it's a pleasure.
Hello.
Right, Jessica, let's begin then with perhaps a rundown of the key issues addressed during the third virtual summit for democracy.
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with the theme here. The focus of this was on misinformation and disinformation, particularly how it's exacerbated and spread more widely through technology. And so Secretary of State Antony Blinken talked about how technology innovation needs to support but not thwart democracy. He defines democracy as something inclusive and respectful of human rights. And we know that in a 2023 State Department report that China has been spending extra money on propaganda throughout Western countries, particularly through news outlets, when it comes to elections. And this is a big election year, as you pointed out earlier. We have more than half of the world's countries going to election. We've seen incidents of disinformation and misinformation in countries around the world during those elections. And the State Department is releasing guidance, actually, for technology companies to help prevent online attacks against human rights activists. And we also saw recently that the U.S. Treasury Department actually launched its first set of sanctions in connection with spyware used to target U.S. activists and journalists. So we're seeing a groundswell of support for this whole theme, and it's an important time to have this discussion.
Right. And Professor Kim, what was your takeaway from this particular summit?
Well, we'll have to understand the context or backdrop against which this democracy summit was inaugurated. In past several years, democracy has been on the defensive. I mean, it's no secret. The number of democratic countries has decreased. So you see fewer democratic countries in the world. Say, 10 years ago, democracy was proliferating. And the quality of democracy has deteriorated as well in democratic countries, maybe because of the surge of extreme populist movements. I think this is a worrying situation. And authoritarian countries are posing significant challenge to this rules-based liberal international order, this international order in which democracy and human rights are respected. So against this backdrop, democratic countries are now trying to sort of come together and to create a unified front against threats posed by authoritarian countries. That, I think, is the most important takeaway. From the perspective of South Korea, another major takeaway is that South Korea, probably as the most dynamic democracy in Asia, is taking a leading role in such endeavor.
Right. Jessica, what's been the response to this latest virtual summit for democracy among pundits there in the U.S.?
Well, it's just wrapped up, so we're still getting some of that information. We don't have a lot of it just yet, but in the past we have had activists argue that, look, well, my country is a democracy, even if it's run by an autocrat, and so there were countries who wanted to be included that haven't. Hungary is an example of that. And the list of invitees has also been controversial because there's also this thought that maybe these summits don't push democracies far enough to defend their democracies against authoritarian forces in their own countries. And the invite list has also angered countries like China with respect to the invitation for Taiwan. So those are the historic gripes about this, but we haven't had a lot of reaction here from the United States just yet.
Right, we're still waiting for that response then. And Professor Kim, as Jessica just mentioned, Beijing did take issue with Seoul's invitation of Taiwanese Digital Minister Audrey Tang to address the gathering on the first day. How do you respond to this conflict?
Well, as far as I know, invitation to this democracy summit is not limited to states, state actors, which means that you can also extend invitation to NGOs and other political entities. So in my personal opinion, inviting Taiwanese minister is not really in conflict with one China policy. And South Korea made it clear a number of times, actually, that we respect one China policy. Nonetheless, China was very critical of our decision, as you said. China said that South Korea would eventually burn and collapse if Korea pursues this avenue. I think China's response was a bit too harsh. As I said, we respect one China policy, but that said, as a leading democracy, leading democratic country in Asia, we care about democracy in Taiwan. If China tries to change the status quo in Taiwan with the force unilaterally, we made it clear. President Yoon made it very clear that South Korea is strongly opposed to it. When democracy was being oppressed in Hong Kong by China years ago, many South Koreans were rooting for democratic protesters in Hong Kong. So likewise, we'll be rooting for Taiwan's democracy if it is suppressed by authoritarian regime in China.
Right. Now, beyond the summit itself, but staying with the idea of democracy, Jessica, a number of U.S. media outlets have been touching upon the fate of America's democracy this year. Now, some of these stories, they date back years, 3 years or so. Speaking as a member of the American media, Jessica, what are your thoughts regarding the state of democracy in the U.S. as it looks to host the November presidential election?
Well, look, we are in the fire here in the United States with respect to the impact of artificial intelligence and technology on misinformation and disinformation on democratic institutions in the United States. We've already seen evidence, a very prolific case that's going on in the courts right now of artificial intelligence misleading voters. There was that case in New Hampshire where a political operative organized, literally hired a magician on the streets of New Orleans to read a robocall sounding then like the voice of President Joe Biden through artificial intelligence, asking voters not to go to the polls back in the New Hampshire primary. Well, those voters have now launched a lawsuit against the person who created that call, as well as 2 of the companies who disseminated it. They're asking for $7,500 per call. So hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages that they're asking for. And that is going to be really closely followed as an example of the dangers of all this. This man has said that, I did this as a wake-up call to the United States, that democracy is endangered by this type of technology. But we do have a political polarization problem in the United States, as we do in much of the world. A 2021 NYU report showing that social media doesn't create that polarization, but it does make it worse. So we're living in a time where we've got technology, we've got social media, specifically AI, changing the game. And we also know that a 2023 PRRI survey shows that nearly a quarter of Americans are now okay with political violence going into this 2024 presidential election. 3/4 of them believe that democracy is at risk. So these are why these important questions are raised. And certainly we are seeing a lot of confirmation that there are serious questions about how this technology will impact the U.S. democratic process going forward into the fall.
Right, indeed. And Professor Kim, for the sake of some comparison, perhaps, what can you tell us about democracy here in South Korea as we speak?
Yeah, as with many other democratic countries, including the United States, there is a lot to be desired in South Korea's democracy. For one thing, partisan politics is way too polarized. I think it's a similar situation in the U.S., as Jessica just mentioned. There's a saying that politics stops at the water's edge, which means that when it comes to foreign policy making, you put aside partisan politics and cooperate with each other for national interests, not for your parochial partisan interests. But that bipartisanship in foreign policy, I think, is a thing of the past in Korean politics. Foreign policy and security policy fell victims to partisan politics, partisan polarization. That said, I think South Korea's democracy is still very healthy. Comparatively speaking, think about the last presidential election. It was a very, very close election. Current President Yoon won the election by 0.7 percentage points. But the opposition party wasted no time and gave a concession speech. No one really challenged the integrity and the veracity of the election outcomes, which I think was a testament to the fact that South Korea's democracy is quite mature.
Right, indeed. Going back to the Summit for Democracy, Jessica, quite a number of pundits have cast doubt on the future of this particular platform in the event of a potential shift in U.S. leadership following the November presidential election. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly this was the brainchild of President Joe Biden. And so if he loses re-election in the fall, it's unlikely that we'll see this go forward. This was a campaign promise that he made and has now made good on by holding this. And so we don't know that the future of this summit will go on under a President Donald Trump. But it is worth noting a criticism of the way that this summit is created. A political theorist from Yale University in Foreign Policy magazine noted that the first summit only included elite, educated, wealthy, older leaders. And so by definition, it is missing the populist sentiment and the blind spot that much of the world had around the rise of populism in the world since 2016. And of course, that is certainly embodied in the presidency of Donald Trump and in the campaign of Donald Trump going into the fall.
And Professor Kim, staying with this hypothetical scenario, how does a potential shift at the White House following the November presidential election in the U.S. look to perhaps affect security concerns here on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, if Mr. Trump goes back to the White House, we worry that he may do some damage to ROK-U.S. alliance because in previous term, he tried to suspend and even cancel altogether this, ROK-U.S. joint military drills. And also, he was very skeptical of large American troop presence in South Korea. So we worry that he might try to withdraw USFK from South Korea, which doesn't really bode well for the future of alliance and doesn't really bode well for the security on the Korean Peninsula. But that being said, I think the alliance will remain intact because there is a very strong constituency for the alliance in Congress, in policymaking circle, in military, in businesses, and think tanks, not just in South Korea, but in the U.S. as well. So I believe there will be a limit to which Mr. Trump will do damage to the alliance. There is also a worry that Mr. Trump might hold another ill-conceived summit with Kim Jong-un. But I don't think another summit is likely because, for one thing, Kim Jong-un isn't really interested in another summit with Trump, given the insult that he received in Hanoi summit in 2019.
Right, and staying with all this, Jessica, what do you believe may be down the road for Seoul-Washington ties under a continued Biden administration and as well as a potential Trump administration?
Well, look, it's no secret that these two candidates have incredibly different approaches to foreign policy. President Biden has reinstituted most, if not all, of the alliances around the world, deepening stability, particularly in Asia, through alliances and strengthening them with not only South Korea, but with the Philippines, with some of the Pacific Islands, with Japan, and seeking not only to have stronger alliances between Washington and the region, but in the region. You think of the Japan-Korea alliance encouragement that Washington has imposed, really in the interests of countering China and North Korea. As for Trump, we do know, of course, that he's not a fan of a lot of alliances, that he's had a more unilateral or bilateral approach, I should say, to foreign policy. And he has raised questions about increasing the cost of cost sharing for U.S. troops in South Korea. And of course, after those conversations, South Korea has raised its share of the cost for the U.S. troops in South Korea. And we know that, as the professor mentioned, President Trump did suspend military drills between South Korea and the United States and also threatened to remove that THAAD missile system. So it is a very different vision for U.S.-South Korea relations, depending on who wins the White House, that is certain. But as the professor also noted, there are more alliances that have been deepened, more pressures coming from the region in particular, asking for U.S. leadership in this part of the world and for U.S. engagement in this part of the world. And so I can certainly understand his hopes from the region that will bear pressure on the White House should Mr. Trump win the White House again.
Right. And Professor Kim, expanding on something that Jessica has just touched upon, this is an impromptu question, but there has been quite a bit of question, that is, on the fate of the 28,500 American soldiers currently stationed in South Korea in the event of a change in American leadership. That being said, Professor Kim, what do you suppose would be the broader implications of perhaps an absence of American soldiers from this part of the world, that is, of course, South Korea?
Well, there is very little doubt that there's going to be a vacuum in South Korea's security. We all know that large troop presence of the United States, USFK, on South Korean soil has been an important deterrent force against North Korea's attempt to launch Second Korean War. So removal of American troop presence, American troops from the South Korean soil will impart a very wrong signal to Mr. Kim Jong-un, in which case he might be very tempted to launch another war on the Korean Peninsula. And early this year, he scrapped a very long time unification policy, North Korean version of unification policy, and redefined inter-Korean relations as a relationship between two hostile countries. So now, as a lot of experts expected, there is a high likelihood of, if not war, major military conflicts on the Korean Peninsula. So removal of USFK, I worry, might send a wrong signal to North Korean leadership.
Right. And Sunny, can I just pick up on that point?
Right, of course, Jessica, go ahead.
From the U.S. perspective, particularly from the Pentagon's perspective, those troops are essential to all of the contingency planning going into what they believe is going to be a 2027 potential invasion of Taiwan. So we've got the plussing up of troops and weapons and strategic information coming out of the Philippines. There's that radar that they're installing in the island of Palau. All of these contingencies are made better and made stronger in terms of a response to a Taiwan invasion by the presence of those troops on the Korean Peninsula. So it's not, for the United States, of course, it's not just about defending its allies in the region against the threat of a nuclear North Korea. It's also about planning for other contingencies. And so to the extent that the White House listens to the Pentagon, which of course it does not always do, there will be a lot of pressure coming from the Pentagon with that, in that regard.
Right, I see. All right, then let's end with one more question back on the Summit for Democracy. Professor Kim, what do you propose to make this particular summit a permanent platform, perhaps, for some tangible action to advance democratic values?
Well, as I said, democracy is under the threat of authoritarian countries, but it is also faced with a host of challenges associated with technological developments. So democracies, I think, should collectively envision a future of technology that can align with democratic values, openness, and human rights. And when democratic countries can work together to establish guidelines and principles for the ethical and rights-respecting use of AI, artificial intelligence, Democracy Summit, I believe, can morph into a more robust, if not permanent, more robust platform to protect and promote democratic values.
Right. All right then, Professor Kim, that's all the time we have for this edition. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Jessica, thank you very much for your insights.
Good to be with you, Sunny.
Right. Well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.